Evening's reading is taken from Esther chapter 4, and this can be found in the church Bibles in front of you on page 503. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
Thank you so much, Rob. Good evening. Good evening. Don't look too excited. It's me up here. My name's Callom. I'm part of the church family here and church staff team. I'm so excited as well to be sharing with you from Esther 4. As you might have just noticed from the reading, this is a pretty epic story, and it's starting to get hot, yeah? It's starting to get a little intense. This is in some ways the turning point, the hinge of the whole book of Esther. And our hero, Esther, starts to show a little bite, I guess you could say. She starts to come into her place. And it needs a little explaining, because we just start in straight with a very depressed guy. If you look at chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. So this is because of the decree in chapter 3. Let me just give you a little recap, a small recap of Esther so far. The Hebrews, God's chosen people, have been taken into exile. They are now in the kingdom of Persia, and a gigantic empire with 127 provinces. So rich, so lavish that the king can have a half-a-year party and then have a 7-day party, just rewarding the people who helped organize said half-a-year party. But the queen of Xerxes the king refused to come and be kind of shown off to all the men when the king called her. So he decided with his advisors to kick her out and have a new queen. And in fact, they had a beauty pageant. And this is where it gets gruesome, where they gathered all the most beautiful women, virgins in the kingdom. They had to go through a beauty treatment process and basically then sleep with the king, and he chose one as queen. It's awful. It's rough. But Esther, a Jew, a Hebrew, won the competition. Not that she really, it wasn't a competition you signed up for, like Love Island or something. This was not something she wanted to be part of. And now, an enemy of the Jews, a guy named Haman, has a real beef with him. And he's convinced the king. To be honest, it didn't take much convincing. I think the king was more just about, let's get to drinks, to sign an edict that says that all of the Jews and all of the kingdom can be exterminated on a certain day. So it makes a bit of sense that Mordecai seems a bit upset, doesn't it? He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. He's going throughout the city, can you imagine, with these rough clothes and ashes over his face, and just yelling and crying. We see in the verse just before in chapter 3, verse 15, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So you can see all the Jews kind of mourning and crying out, and what are we to do? This is hopeless. And the rest of the city as well going, where did that come from? This is confusing. So we go on, verse 2. He went on as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. And in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. It's dire. It's desperate. It's not looking good for the people of God. And you notice Mordecai, he goes to the king's gate, but he stops there. He doesn't go any further, because you're not allowed to be upset or sad or mourning in the king's land. All is happiness. Everything is awesome, if you like the Lego movie. No crying. But he stops there. He's in that area because Esther's servants surely can spot him as well. So we have the decree. And next, we have the dilemma. Verse 4, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. He refuses the clothes. Now, some people say that, this is Esther. She's off in her ivory tower. She's gotten so far distant, she doesn't know what's going on. All the Jews in the area are weeping and crying, and she's just gotten so into palace life that she sees, that's a bad outfit. Here, I saw you're upset, but this will fix it. Have some nice clothes. But I don't think that's actually what's going on, though it's true. Esther has been distanced from her people. But she didn't choose that. She was forced into that. But it does make sense if Mordecai, who is her cousin, by the way, and her ward, can't come in through the king's gate if he's wearing sackcloth and ashes. Well, if she's going to find out what's going on, maybe give him some clothes so he can come in and they can have a chat. I think it's actually much more practical. But he refuses them. He's almost making a statement. No, I am staying in my mourning clothes. So then we have this back and forth conversation with a servant in between. Verse 5, Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach goes, like a good servant. He went out to Mordecai, verse 6, in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Did you hear that? I tried to emphasize a bit. To show her, in verse 8, he showed the copy of the text of the edict, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Mordecai, throughout Esther so far, has been instructing Esther from afar. And this is a pretty desperate situation. So he's coming to Esther. She's the queen. You can do something. But here's a catch. He told Esther specifically earlier on, don't tell them you're a Jew. She's been living a double life, you could say. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. But she's now Queen Esther. And no one knows in the court that she actually, the queen, kind of one of the top three people in the palace, the king, the queen, the kind of prime minister person, Haman, is actually one of these Hebrews who are supposed to be exterminated soon. She has two identities. And he's telling her, did you see right there at the end of verse 8, he ends with this, go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Your people, Esther. I know I told you earlier, don't say you're a Jew. Well, now I'm saying, go and tell them you're a Jew. Go and plead for your people. She has a double identity, you could say. And I think as Christians, at least for myself, we can identify with that in a way. We are saved by God. We are part of his family. But so often, at least in my instance, when I'm sitting at the bus stop and chatting to somebody, or I'm walking my dog and chatting, people love to chat to you if you have a dog, or in lots of other situations, I'm driving to a football match with one of my teammates, I want to share about my relationship with God, my belief in Jesus, but often I panic, I get afraid, I don't. And so I almost have this double identity where I'm a child of God, but some people don't really know that about me. Over here, I'm kind of a child of God. Over here, I'm just Callom. He's just, an okay bloke. Strange accent. She has a double identity here. There's a dilemma, but the dilemma gets even worse. So verse 9, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. By the way, just an aside, but isn't it interesting, poor Hathach going back and forth. And I wonder if an eyelid jumped up even a bit when he learned that the queen is a Jew, or if he's just British stoicism kind of back and forth doing my job. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces, aka you too, Mordecai, know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So there's a big problem. You can't go to the king unless he calls you. And if you do, you're supposed to be put to death. Unless the king looks up and goes, yeah, you're a friend. I'll extend the gold scepter to you this time. Don't do it again. But I'll let you off this time. It's all right. Now you might think, she's the queen. She was chosen in a beauty pageant of tons of women. The king chose her to be the queen, so good standing, right? And then there's this kind of brutally honest last bit, the end of verse 11. 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. This is hard, but it's kind of true. Esther, by no choice of her own, is a sex symbol of the kingdom of Persia. She is a pretty face. And the king has not likely to call her other than when he wants to sleep with her. It's not likely as well that he's gone a month without sleeping with someone, just going off what he's like. So in other words, she's saying, my one advantage is kind of gone. I'm out of favor. So not only do I have to run the risk of will he of going in front of him in the first place, and that means death, and will he offer the scepter or not? But even if he did offer the scepter, I'm not likely to get anywhere with him. He doesn't like me anymore, it seems. Or he's forgotten about me. Basically, it's looking like death for me if I go before him. She has a big dilemma here. But we know, because we've already read the passage, that she decides to go. She decides to do it. What is it then that sways her? What is it that helps her to decide to kind of step into the light, to identify with God's people, to go before the king, to risk it all, to say, if I perish, I perish? Well, it's here in verses 12 and 14. There's kind of two things here. A reminder and a challenge from Mordecai. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, and notice here Hathach disappears. He's still going back and forth, but now it's zeroing in on the words. He sent back this answer to Esther: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." A reminder and a challenge. What is Mordecai saying here? What is he talking about? Well, first of all, he says, relief and deliverance, even if you're silent, even if you don't go to the king, deliverance will come to the Jews from somewhere. Now, does he kind of have in his back pocket a kind of, assassinate the king button or something? Or what is he talking? How could he believe this? Well, he's reminding Esther, he's trusting, and he's reminding her about the promises of God. See, this is actually a huge dilemma. This is what God says to Abram, kind of the founding father of the Hebrews. In Genesis chapter 12, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." Now, you can see why even exile, they're kind of going, what is going on here? But extermination as well? "I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I'll curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." See, God has always had a plan to reach all the nations of this world, to share with them the love of God, that they could know him and be restored in relationship with him. And he does that through people. And he started it with a guy named Abram. He changed his name to Abraham. And it's been building as a people through his family ever since. But here we are, the descendants of that family, the Jewish people, are about to be exterminated. And I don't think it's likely that there were many or any Jews, really, outside of this kingdom. It covered a lot of land. So they're facing, how in the world does God keep his promise? Mordecai is saying, I know, because he said, through us, we will be a blessing. He'll make our name great. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through us. So I think Mordecai is saying, look, God is not going to go back on his promise. I don't know how, but somehow he's going to stay true to his word. And I'm trusting that. And it also sounds a bit like a threat, doesn't it? But you and your father's family will perish. Well, the interesting thing is that Esther's parents are actually perished already, and Mordecai himself is kind of adopted her. But I think, again, he's reminding her of Genesis 12. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. He's reminding her of the promises of God. There's also a challenge. This is probably the most famous verse in all of Esther. Many of you are probably already familiar with it. The end of chapter 14. Verse 14, not chapter. Who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this? It sounds pretty epic, doesn't it? But he's saying, look, maybe it wasn't an accident that Vashti the queen balked at the idea of going in front of all the men to be shown off. Maybe it wasn't an accident that she was kicked out. Maybe it wasn't an accident that this terrible beauty pageant happened. and that she won, so that Esther has become queen of Persia for such a time as this. Maybe somebody's working in the background in all of this. God is never mentioned in all of the book of Esther, but you can just see these undercurrents of how you don't have to mention him. He's at work, whether you mention him or not. A helpful verse that talks about this, the idea is God's providence of his working in history, his working in our lives as well, is also from Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. He then gets wrongly accused and thrown into prison. But then eventually he starts climbing the ladder and he becomes number 2 of Egypt, interprets some dreams successfully, and helps Egypt and a lot of the surrounding land, including the people of God, from starvation. And when his brothers finally realize just who this very powerful man they're standing in front of is, that it's their brother they sold long ago into slavery because they disliked him quite a bit. This is what Joseph says. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. A lot of evil that we see in the world is when people try and take on being God for themselves. But part of what Joseph is saying here is you can't out-God God. He will work out what his plans and his will, even through sometimes evil people, evil actions. The epitome of that is the cross, where an innocent man was tried unjustly and tortured brutally and killed for us. You might have many questions rumbling in your mind about that, about the idea of God's providence and working through evil. I'd really recommend 2 resources really quick, and then I need to move on. One is Tim Keller's book on suffering. If you'd like to investigate that further, he talks a lot about it. And the other would be, if you want to look on YouTube for Vince Vitale, Vitale, any of his talks on suffering. He often engages with this topic. But Mordecai is reminding Esther of God's promises and God's providence. Perhaps she has been placed here just for this moment. And so we have the decision. Verse 15, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Esther makes her decision, but it's a very God-dependent decision, isn't it? She turns to fasting, and one can only assume prayer. And all the Jews will join her in that. No longer a fasting of mourning, but a fasting of petition for Esther as she goes before the king. So what happens? What happens when she goes to the king? Well, that's for next week. Tune in next time. Clickbait. But what about for us? What does this all mean for us? I just want to give you 3 things. And the first one is that Esther points to Jesus. If you think about that, someone going before the ruler of the land, interceding for God's people, a rescue line, though it risks death itself. Doesn't that remind you of Jesus? Esther would have been, I think, in her 20s at this point. Jesus was just a few years older. Both facing judgment and death. Both walking into a seat of human power. Both seemingly powerless, going just on their own. No use of force. Both representing, coming for the people of God. Esther, imperfectly, she doesn't always make right decisions, but believes God's covenant promise. Jesus, the perfectly obedient Son of the Father. Esther fasted. Jesus prayed heart-wrenching prayers in Gethsemane. Esther said, if I die, I die. Jesus said, not my will, but your will be done. Esther faced possible death. Jesus faced certain death for us. Esther points to Jesus. And I don't know about you, but as I think about Jesus and how in some ways he's an even greater Esther, it makes me want to worship him. It makes me want to say, thank you, Jesus. So if that's you too, you can thank him now. Go for it. No time like the present. Esther points to Jesus. And second, God is at work in our lives. Trust him. God is at work in our lives. Trust him. You see, none of us probably, I'm assuming, are going to be put in a position quite like Esther, going before the most powerful person in the world, risking death just by coming in the door and saying, excuse me. But it's still true that in all of our lives, God is at work. And sometimes we can feel, gosh, I can't see that in my job or in my neighborhood, or my friend group. Maybe you don't even like your job, your neighborhood, your friends group, where you are. But who knows? But maybe you've been brought to that place for such a time as this. Maybe God has been actually preparing you and giving you the gifts and the personality he's given you for that place, to represent God's people in that place, to share God's truth in that place, to stand for God in that place. Who knows? Maybe he's been preparing Callom Harkrader for the Above Our Church football team for such a time as this. You laugh, but that's kind of exciting at the same time, isn't it? There's meaning to where you are and who you are with God over it all. Will you trust him? Like Esther. Also, isn't it wonderful that Esther first throws the objections? She's not just cast as some sort of superhero. She puts out the objections first. So don't think I'm just not like Esther. Esther is just brilliant. No, Esther was kind of like, Mordecai, you know full well, if I do this, what's going to happen? God is at work in our lives. Trust him. And finally, through Jesus, we are the people of God. Identify with him. I mentioned that kind of identity crisis, in a way, you could say, for Esther. Does she identify with the people of God or not? What is she to do? And I think so often for us, we feel fear, we feel shame, we feel some sort of block in our throat whenever there's an opportunity to talk about God or about faith. We feel suddenly a huge rumbling in our stomachs. Maybe it's just me. You all are looking like, no, that doesn't happen to me. We feel lots of barriers and blockades to being a Christian in everyday life. It's just talking about God. I just want to encourage you, if you're a Christian, it makes sense that once in a while, I'm not saying every other word, you would talk about Christ. See, if a person's a baker, I expect them to talk about baking a whole lot. I'd be surprised if Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood didn't talk to me about baking. If somebody's a dog lover, like me, they talk about their dog a lot. If somebody's a Christian, even if society kind of gets a little nervous around religious talk, it's expected, surely, you talk about Christ once in a while. It's okay. In fact, it's normal and natural to talk about Jesus. We don't have to be silent. And even if pressure comes to not talk about it, I'll talk about him occasionally anyway. He's Jesus. He's amazing. He's awesome. Identify with him. If you've put your trust in him, you are now part of the family of God. Live like it. But also be excited about it. I'll close with this. Look at verse 17 again. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Seems like, that's just reporting the facts, isn't it, surely? This is actually the first time in the book of Esther that Esther tells Mordecai what to do. Every other time so far, Mordecai's telling Esther, do this, don't do that. Don't tell him you're a Jew. Tell him you're a Jew now. But now Esther has decided, right, I'm doing this. I'm going to identify as one of the people of God. I'm going to trust his promises. And if I die, I die. And she starts to take action. Esther, through no fault of her own, has had a lot of things just happening to her. A lot of really awful things, to be honest. But when she embraces God's calling on her life, she starts to call some of the shots herself. She starts actually leading the people of God. And from this point forward, Esther is referred to as Queen Esther 14 times in the book of Esther. 13 of them are after verse 17 of chapter 4. A coincidence, maybe? I don't think so. I think there's something exciting that we come alive when we embrace that maybe we have been prepared for such a time as this. Maybe God is with us and for us. That we can come alive and become the people we were meant to be. No longer just having things happen to us, but living an exciting life for God's kingdom, for God's glory. The decree, the dilemma, the decision. Maybe you want to look at these just for a moment. Is one of them particularly God speaking to you about? And let me pray as the band comes up. Father, I thank you so much that you made us to know you. And this, despite the decree that the wages of sin is death, and the dilemma of you wanting relationship with us, but we cannot work ourselves back to you. Jesus faced the ultimate decision, and he said, I will go. And in your judgment, and in your justice, and in your mercy, and in your love, you rescued us so that we can live in the promises and the providence of God. Help us to know these truths. Help us to know this deep down inside of us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.